Welcome to the Paul Spradley Show, a show dedicated to real strategies from real people practicing real leadership in diverse and inclusive cultures. And now here's your host, CEO of the diversity training firm, the Care-Based Leadership Collaborative, Dr. Paul David Spradley.
Hello and welcome to the Paul Spradley Show. I'm your host, Dr. Paul David Spradley, and my guest today is Dr. Brenda J. Allen. Dr. Allen is a professor emeritus from the University of Colorado, Denver, and for over 30 years she led the diversity and equity efforts at the university, which is quite an accomplishment, serving at 2 schools and lots of opportunities there. Dr. Allen is a self-described foodie, self-care radical, and lover of audiobooks, and noted scholar with over 50 authored or co-authored publications. That's pretty impressive. And so with that in mind, I'd like to welcome to the show, all the way from sunny Colorado, Dr. Brenda J. Allen. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Spradley.
And so I want to dive right in because you have quite an amazing story. How did you get into doing diversity work? Tell me about your career path and how you got into this work.
Oh, that's such a great question. It's hard to know where to dive in. Let me start at graduate school. I was at Howard University completing my doctoral studies in organizational communication and also teaching full-time as a lecturer in an entirely different subject matter than organizational communication when I had an opportunity to apply for a position at the University of Colorado based on a colleague that I met at Howard University. And I applied for the position and was excited to actually be hired in the role to come to the University of Colorado at Boulder and to begin my life as a scholar of computer-mediated communication, because that's what I was completing my dissertation work on. I came to the University ABD doing a project at PBS's corporate headquarters in Virginia on how they used email as a brand new way to communicate. So, that's dating me quite a bit. However, when I got to CU Boulder, I was really intrigued by what I later learned to call identity politics in terms of assumptions people were making about me and what my scholarship area might be, assumptions about relationships that I had just having moved to Colorado and having, for example, the contractor's office at the university call me to ask if I had some contacts who could help them with minority-owned businesses. So that's just one little example of the kinds of assumptions I was met with when I got to the campus based on me being a twofer, both female and African American. So because of those kinds of dynamics and other things that I was experiencing, I actually decided to change my area of focus as a scholar from computer-mediated communication to looking at issues of social identity, power in organizationals, with my broad area of research and scholarship being in organizational communication, but especially in higher ed. So I'll stop there to say that is, in a nutshell, how I got started.
So you were very fluid in your career. You talk about the idea of you switched your focus area of research. Was that challenging for you to do, to make that switch, or was that something that your gut was sort of encouraging you to do anyway?
That I don't recall that being very challenging because it's the nature of the experience of many underrepresented or minoritized people, I believe, in higher education, regardless of whatever our areas of expertise might be, the kinds of expectations others have of us that we will serve in some sort of capacity, assisting with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for me as well, I had been socialized as a Black woman to care for these kinds of issues. So with that combination, and to a certain extent, I had been doing it already. And then making the actual switch, however, in terms of research, publication, presentations, and so forth, I was fortunate to have a group of colleagues in the Department of Communication at the University of Colorado Boulder at that time who themselves were amenable to me making that kind of change. And for the kind of initial work I had done in terms of the methodology, in terms of some of the questions I had been posing already, it was relatively easy for me to make that switch, particularly in the scholarship part. For the teaching as well, it was not too difficult because I was already enacting, embodying some of the characteristics of an educator, of a scholar activist that became even more rewarding when I could fully claim it.
Yeah, so I appreciate the fact that you've entered the conversation already as an activist, and so you're saying that there wasn't much in the space of growth, but one of the things that you did say that I want to talk about a little bit is that sometimes underrepresented people that are moving into spaces in higher education, sometimes underrepresented people feel like they have to be the voice, that they have to be the educator, that they have to be the diversity champion. Do you see that as being true, and is that problematic, or what are your thoughts around that?
My experience is that tends to be the case, and in particular for those members of the underrepresented or minoritized groups who ourselves are really aware of being other, of being an outsider within. And so, yeah, I think that still persists. And I think that it is quite problematic for a couple of reasons. It's problematic, for one, in terms of, in my case, again, as I retrospectively make sense of it, I feel really good about the decision and the career pathway and so forth that kind of aligns with my values overall. And I've always wanted to work with people, et cetera, et cetera. However, I can think about persons who might have other career aspirations that don't necessarily really resonate easily or overlap easily with doing social sciences work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, where, for instance, maybe someone in biology or someone in some other area, it just seems unfair that there's that expectation. And not only the expectation, but of course, the other kinds of institutionalized isms, such as institutionalized racism, sexism, heterosexism, et cetera, classism, that then make it really hard for someone who's a member of a minoritized group to become part of a discipline or a department where there's not only that sense of you're good for working on these kinds of issues related to your identity. And in fact, we hired you because we could say we got one, right? We could check it off graphically. And yet, you know, there's a subtle and sometimes not so subtle, implicit and explicit notion of you don't belong here. So It gets hounded.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and you talk about so many of the nuances of what's happening internally as well too. From a broad perspective, so your work is traveled across the world. As an author, and some would say that you're in the top 50 D&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion presenters, trainers in the country. Why? Let's just start with a simple question. Why is diversity, equity, and inclusion important? Like, why were you doing the work that you were doing at CU Denver, and why is that work important to continue?
So, and I appreciate that you're referring to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because all of those matter, and they matter individually and collectively. They matter for just in terms of who, let's take the United States, who we claim to be as a nation, in terms of liberty and justice for all, the notion of equality, democracy. If we're not really valuing diversity, that is to say the ways that human beings vary from one another, and in particular those persons who are historically and currently members of disenfranchised groups, if we're not really striving for equity, that is to say where we are really serving and providing access for everyone according to who they are, and if we're also not striving for inclusion, which means that we're really thoughtful about everyone feels a sense of value and belonging, then we cannot achieve just that basic notion of liberty and justice for all. And then in our organizations, institutions, more often than not, there's some claim, some allegation in terms of a mission statement, values, et cetera, along those lines. Second, in addition to that, and I'm sure most of the listeners, and I know you are familiar with this moral ethical imperative as well as the bottom line imperative, that any kind of organization or institution currently and into the future is not going to thrive as well as it could if it does not place emphasis on and resources toward diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Why not though, right? So if I'm the person who's saying, I don't really want to grow, like things have worked out well for me to this point, you're saying
Yes.
that we have to change the way we're thinking moving forward, and I'm saying why? Like for that person who's battling or struggling in that space, what's the why for them? Why do they need to understand this for their corporate spaces to be successful?
Yeah, that is a compelling and important and persistent question that really is the foundation of a lot of the work that I'm doing. I'm especially focusing these days on inclusive leadership. And as I work with people in professional development, I actually strive, first of all, to identify my sense of what their why might be so that I come prepared, whether it's a training, a one-on-one conversation, or whatever it might be. I come prepared with my ideas of what they might be, but then I also really try to invite them to get clarity for how it specifically matters to them, whether it is because of their the actual institution, the organization. Again, what is their mission? What is their bottom line? What are they trying to accomplish? I often also look to see what are their benchmarks, who are the leaders in their area, so that to have the competitive advantage, more and more institutions, organizations have to have that clarity. So that's one of the ways that I approach the why is, again, back to bottom line, but with specifics, with data, with forecasts,
right,
et cetera. I also, though, really also try to appeal to persons individually in terms of what their value systems might be. And I'm heartened that often with that kind of, and on my part, it's a genuine invitation, because I get it in terms of it's easy for me because it's probably part of who I just am in general, but I've grown increasingly. So in terms of empathy, of genuinely trying to meet people where they are, and genuinely, it's hard for me to understand why people don't understand why, right? And yet I know if I'm to be effective, if we are to indeed reap the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I've got to be open to folks' resistance, but also trying to gracefully engage with them in ways that they can get in touch with. What are your values in general? And then I can try to connect those values to here's how that then can matter in this instance. I also try to help people understand, for some people, some issues are extremely difficult to access because of their privilege, that they've lived such a life where they can easily afford to be oblivious, right, to how significant these issues are. So then I might try to find a compelling story that's right within, or someone that they actually know, for them to get a clearer sense of what is it like to be that person. Now, I'm saying this as if it's an easy accomplishment. It's not necessarily. I just, however, know that part of good DEI work is that deepening that notion of why. And I sometimes refer people to, are you familiar with Simon Sinek's work, the Start With Why?
I am, yeah.
I actually take some of the ways that he approaches it. And frankly, I even invoke some of, authors and other approaches to how to do business that don't necessarily, as he does not, as far as I'm aware, he doesn't focus specifically on DEI, but he does talk about the idea of how it's important to understand the why. Does that get at what you were seeking in terms of that notion of why?
It does, and one of the things I love when we talk is you are such an educator at heart. You'll always go back and check for understanding. And I deeply value that about you. So it does make sense, yes. I did want to follow up around the space that you create, right? So it seems like one of the things that you do really well, and the words that you just recently said was, I give space for the person who is essentially a dissenter, right? Like you let them have their feelings while also creating a framework for them to understand value around that why.
Yes.
Do you feel like this work gets, the burden gets heavy at times when you're trying to create that space and you have that person that's resisting?
Yes, it's extremely burdensome and heavy. And part of what I am deeply appreciating about being in semi-retirement is, quite frankly, I'm picking and choosing the persons with whom I'm working to reduce the possibility of encountering a lot of that kind of resistance. I've chosen to really be selective with my clients. I want to have a sense that they are deeply committed and open and receptive to really growing and affecting change. And Dr. Spradley, I realize how fortunate and privileged I am to be able to do that, as so many people will continue to be in roles such as mine and yours, where those dissenters are never, that's always going to be a part of the territory.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was reading a little bit about you when you were retiring from your university, and just the amount of people that you've impacted with your work, with your ability to care. Who are your heroes and sheroes, the folks who've made an impact in your life? Like I look at you and I see a person who is just so calm and has this demeanor about her that just commands this sort of love. But who have you looked up to? Who's helped shape you into the person that you've become?
That's another wonderful question. I'd have to start with my mother. As a single parent raising my brother, sister, and me in the projects in Youngstown, Ohio, extremely resilient and loving and caring. She really gave me full, dare I say, freedom or leeway to be whomever I wanted to be. And she modeled for me a very, very strong work ethic, being compassionate toward others and so forth. So I'd have to begin with her. And then I have really referred quite frequently to various authors and luminaries to gain my sense of myself. I was doing what is now called, I think they're now calling it self-development, not self-help, right?
Right.
I think it's self-help, right? Helping yourself. You mentioned I'm very much into radical self-care. So I can go all the way back to the Four Agreements. Those kinds of readings and those authors really have made a difference to me as they continue to do so. So those, I would call upon those. And then I've had, I would say, not so much as role models, but people who have helped my path, helped me along the way so that I could continue to thrive, continue to become who I'm still becoming. And so I can point to even going back to Howard University, where for the first time, quite frankly, I had African-American faculty, right? I hadn't had a Black teacher or educator all the way from kindergarten all the way through undergrad. And so I had a couple of very strong they were role models in terms of how to do education well, as well as really supporting and encouraging me. And the one that comes to mind in particular is Dr. Orlando Taylor. I recall him teaching a course in statistics and really breaking it down in a type of a blended Black vernacular with highly scholar language of an academic that really modeled for me the possibilities of being in this kind of role.
That's incredible, yeah. And so I just, like even as you were talking, one of the things that the first time that we got together, you pulled out of me was your story is valuable. And it sounds like you've had people do that with you. Why is that something that you, and even in talking this morning, or talking earlier in the show, you said that the idea of leaning on your own experiences was important in your career trajectory. Why is that something that is important for you? This idea that personal story has significant value in your life trajectory?
Oh yeah, another phenomenal question. I believe that just the idea of valuing story in the first place, of understanding that one story is something significant, actually kind of disrupts how in higher education in particular, and I think in US society, Western society period, the notion of rationality and being much more concerned with certain ways of sharing and expressing that haven't often left room for story, and in fact think of story and narrative and even qualitative methods, et cetera, right, as not really being valuable. So it's one of the things as I go back to my experience when I shifted my area of scholarship, research, and teaching from computer mediated communication to social identity and power was that at that time, and especially in the department where I was, there was a lot of value on autoethnography. And so I studied that as a type of method and realized once again that that was part of how I was engaging with life anyway, how I was engaging with students. And my colleagues were always fascinated by the deep rapport I established with students. And of course, those were primarily white students. And all of my colleagues were white. And I think they didn't necessarily invoke race, but I think they were surprised at how could I get that kind of rapport. And part of it was I invited those students to really tell me who they were, especially because I heard my colleagues, many of my colleagues routinely homogenizing them as these white students. And by the way, these are my white colleagues, right? And so I wanted to really see those students, each one, I wanted to individuate. And I did that through something as simple as an opening assignment of tell me who you are and express that in any way that you'd like. And then I began to share about me. And then that really lapped over into the research and writing that I was doing, where I did this kind of hybrid. For example, one of my first publications, I challenged a key theory of socialization in organizational communication, which says it's a stage model. You come in, you go through metamorphosis, you fit in, et cetera, et cetera. I took that theory and I blended in my experience coming to CU Boulder as an outsider within with what the developing body of research from other scholars of color, plus looking at other theories. So I did this kind of hybrid, and it was extremely well received. So I see the value of story from the perspective of the academy and types of methods and types of teaching and learning, as well as, I have to say, of course, my own lived experience as an African American who comes from, in my case, because we know it's not so necessarily for all African Americans, but for me, where story and who you are was just crucial in my community.
Absolutely. Can a person engage in this DEI work, diversity, equity, inclusion, can they engage in this work and not be self-reflective and not understand their own identity?
I don't think they can really be as effective as they might be if they don't do it for at least two reasons. One is that really can help, and I'll use first person. I find that notion of me being self-reflective extremely valuable because I can identify places, for example, where I have privilege. And I have to get access to that. If I'm going to work with others and try to invite them to check their privilege, I've got to understand how that operates for me. And by the way, I think that self-reflective work needs to be complex. I think we need to keep engaging in it for our own sakes, right? And how we do the work and can, again, relate to others as well as be authentic in that kind of work. The second reason, though, is because to do the work well, as we work with others, I believe it's essential that we invite them to also be self-reflective. So I cannot ask you to do something, I don't think, and that's how I teach, that's how I engage, try to engage in relationships, et cetera, is I can't ask you to do something that I'm not also doing.
As we begin to wrap up, there's folks like you that are doing this work at the national level. My question to you is, are you hopeful about our future? Currently there's a lot of, I would say, even conflict between various groups of folks. Are you hopeful? And if so, tell me why.
I am cautiously hopeful, yes. And I'm hopeful because I wish I could quote it appropriately or accurately. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. about the arc of the universe is I think he says it's long, but it's curved toward justice. I believe that we are really literally going through turbulent times, that we're going to emerge for the better on the other side. And I also have, one of the things I was heartened by in my role that I just left in April as a chief diversity officer for 2 campuses was post the presidential election, and increasingly so even up until the time that I left, and even now that I've left the university, there are colleagues who would have indicated that they care about DEI, who once they began to see the kinds of things that were happening and are happening, it's the equivalent to me of put me in, coach, right? I'm now really ready to do this work because I see how significant it is. And I have the advantage of working with so many different kinds of people. And now that I'm retired, the kinds of people who are approaching me and inviting me to engage with them in this work leads me to think that there's so much hard work and focused work going on with a lot of different kinds of people, with people who otherwise would be more like complacent than actually against the work. And so those are some places where I see hope. I see so many positions popping up. I don't, however, I really look at that with a little side eye, because I think sometimes folks are doing it just to say, look at us, we created this position. Right. But I also have some confidence that some of those are genuine, legitimate. And, the fact that you and I are even having this conversation, and there's so many people interested in this and wanting to do the work, those are just some of the reasons why I am cautiously optimistic. How do you feel?
I too am cautiously optimistic. I think that, and the reason that we started this podcast is so that people are able to pick up tools to arm themselves so that they can go into their workspaces. They can go into Thanksgiving dinner when they have a family member say something, and they have language for how to navigate those spaces, but also know that they're not alone. So I'm cautiously optimistic, and there's lots of work to be done. I'm grateful that you took time out of your busy schedule to chat with us, and the folks that are listening are grateful as well too. How can people follow you or stay in contact with you?
I have a relatively dormant Twitter account. Maybe this will inspire me to start sharing, and that is at the Brenda J.J.A.Y. Allen. And I also have a website, differencematters.info. And I'm on LinkedIn.
Okay. I'll put all that in the show notes, and really appreciate you being on the show, Dr. Allen. Thank you so much. We appreciate you. That's our time for today. Thank you, the listener, for making this show as popular as it is. Our next 3 episodes will really be around the conversation with folks who are working in the community, all very unique backgrounds. You won't want to miss it. Also, please subscribe to this podcast. It helps boost our presence on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and other podcast hosting sites. I'm Dr. Paul David Spradley. Until next time, keep on caring.